Apparently not everybody's a deer hunter, or else you already got your deer, and now you're here for part two. So thank you all for coming. So, all right, one disclaimer, several people have mentioned about the parking situation, which is not good, and the parking lot is not in the best shape, and just let you know that we are not in control of that, but we will talk to the park district because I think something might have been done to get that, make that a little bit more user-friendly out there. So be careful when you go out, as you know that the walking is a little treacherous out there. So we have some people in the out there in the hallway. So if you can project as much as you can. So
if you can't hear me, just let me know.
I was 46 years in education, so projecting has never been a problem. Maybe in some cases there was too much projection, but again, thank you for being here. Well, you know why we're here. The book, which I know that some people were here last week who have already read the book, and I did myself. Those Turbulent Sons of Freedom. It reads very, very well, but I guess if you are a New York Times correspondent, writing is something that's your forte. So for those of you who haven't seen the bio on Christopher, he was a foreign correspondent, reporter, and editor for the New York Times, and he was a bureau chief in Moscow, Cairo, Beijing, Ottawa, Johannesburg. I'm not sure if there's any other spots in between it, but
is that all?
And he lives in Thetford, so traveling, some of you came from a distance, he probably came from further away. And I sent him the last email I sent, I said, I'm not sure if you know where the homestead is, but if you can navigate around Cairo, you can probably find the town homestead, as he did without any problems. And you are currently teaching at Dartmouth, a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, which is handy because it's almost within walking distance of Thetford, or not quite.
22 minutes.
22 minutes. All right, so I will get out of the way and we'll turn this over to Christopher. So again, thank you for being here, Christopher.
I should say that as a journalist, and I'll talk about why I ended up writing a book about the American Revolution and Ethan Allen.
You'll have to talk louder.
Can you hear me?
Maybe get closer to them.
Yeah, I'll speak up more if you don't hear me.
There's people all out there.
Yeah, the microphone is actually working for the camera, I think. But if you, does that make any difference?
No.
All right, I'll speak out, and if you can't hear me, just holler. As a journalist, one of the things I learned as a journalist is there's no such thing as a dumb question. Only dumb answers. So if you have some questions, if you think, whatever you want to ask, it's fine. I should mention I'm accompanied by two people who mean a great deal to me. One is my wife, Jacqueline, who agreed to marry me 53 years ago and said, well, I'll give it a try. And also, she accompanied me through all the postings overseas. And I think it was 8 postings, 7 postings, and then the Times asked me to go down back and work in the Washington Bureau. And Jacqueline said she'd moved 7 times from the New York Times, and she was damned if she'd do it an 8th time. And Clark Graff, who got me over here, who's our architect and a very close neighbor. He hasn't gotten his deer yet, but that's all right. And he came along. So anyway, I want to talk a bit about why I would dare write a book about the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen. And as you know, I said I had, when I retired from the New York Times, somebody said, I walked up here from New York. I thought that was a great idea. It was really a dumb idea. I do not recommend it, because every time I go back to the Times, they say, did you walk down here? I said, no way. So anyway, when I retired to the New York Times, I'd been a foreign correspondent, as you know, and we moved to Vermont to renovate a farmhouse in Thetford in 1784. It's the other side of the mountains, for those of you who don't know where Thetford is. And I got really interested in the whole question about what, how history is reported. And I know I'd covered wars for the New York Times, 7 or 8, but I found, and I'd covered wars across time zones. I was here, and then we'd have to be over here, and they moved you around, especially if it was a hot situation. But I never thought I would be able to do it across centuries. And I thought, as I began to work on this book, if I were going to be covering this war, knowing what I know as a war correspondent, what would I look for? And what are the questions I would ask? And who would I want to talk to? And so this got me involved in this. I had bought a book. Our farmhouse was built in 1784. One of the oldest houses in the Upper Valley there. And it was I was curious about what it was like when this house was built. And also I bought at an auction a book about Vermont written in 225 years ago, called The Natural and Civil History of Vermont. And those of you who would like to take a look at it, it's quite fascinating. One thing you do learn is that historians back then, they were not reluctant to borrow from each other. And so and you see the same quote showing up over and over, even if it was wrong, so to speak. They said to do that. But you might want to take a look at this because it's a great book. And the binding was done by my wife here, who was a children's librarian, and she figured if the children didn't care, I shouldn't care. So anyway, let me talk about this Ethan Allen. What interested me was who Ethan Allen was, and I should say he's a character that everybody knows, but nobody knows. He leaves us no portraits. There's not even a great gravestone for him, and he could do no wrong in the popular imagination. But he was far more complex than history gives him credit for. He was a loudmouth opportunist, an inept battlefield tactician. The only battle he really fought in was to try to capture Montreal, which was a really dumb idea. And he got caught on that one and shipped off to England to be hanged, as you know. But when he was in captivity, which was about 2 years and 8 months, he rose to the occasion and was very courageous. And when he was finally paroled in New York City, and he made a point of going and visiting all of the places of the prisoners, and there were like 8,000 prisoners, I think, that died, took terrible casualties in New York City. He went out and documented all of them. So he had real guts. The question is, did he use them in the right time? And he was an inept battlefield tactician, but he was a charismatic propagandist who could win people over, who inspired or coerced other settlers to join him. And his courage surfaced after he got himself captured by disobeying orders. Also, Ethan Allen even couldn't be trusted to keep his mouth shut. He went into secret negotiations with the British that were not taken seriously by many historians, but I think say a lot more about him than that deserves to be known. The evidence is that he wanted Vermont eventually. The big thing was land, because in New England and land, your wealth, your status, your social standing, your future, all depended on how much land you owned. And so there were no banks, There were no mutual funds, you know. So if you needed that anchor to, you needed that source of revenue. And so he got into that to a fairly well. He wanted Vermont to become a neutral republic, thriving on trade with markets like Canada or Britain overseas. As late as July 1778, nearly 5 years after the peace treaty was signed, ending the revolution, Ethan Allen was still lamenting that Vermont could have become a province of Great Britain. So, as I looked at that, I began to say, who else? Ethan Allen is a fascinating character. We can get more into, and I also welcome what you have to say. Anybody who has thoughts, and especially if you disagree with me, because I remember surviving page 1 meetings at the New York Times where everybody had their knife out. So you can't insult me. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Who are the people who we kind of overlook? And one of them is Ethan Allen's brother, Ira, who really was he was the smartest of the Allen brothers. And his cousin, Seth Warner, who I think was a real hero of the American Revolution and of the Green Mountain Boys. And he's the one who developed techniques when if I jump ahead, the Battle of Hubbardton that I can talk about later, which is one of the great battles of the American Revolution that stopped the British, stopped Burgoyne from coming down and trying to overrun what is now Vermont, New Hampshire grants. And Seth Warner is the one who did that. And the other person that Ethan hated was his more competent rival, Benedict Arnold. And he really disliked him. But his real enemies were pretty much anyone from New York. I hope there's nobody from New York. We were down last week in Pennsylvania, New Hope, Pennsylvania. I didn't think I could insult the Pennsylvanians, but anyway. His enemies are from New York who threatened the land that he laid claim to. And I didn't understand how unpopular our war for independence was in Britain, because they couldn't get people to sign up to come up and fight here. And they had to bring in, not Hessians, but Brunswickers, to come in and do the fighting. They claimed they were not mercenaries, that they were there on soldiers of fortune, but they were mercenaries. So, and they did that, and some of the heaviest fighting that the Green Mountain Boys and American patriots had here was not against the British, but against the hired Braunschweigers. So, the other thing I didn't notice, I didn't realize when I wrote this book, was that patriots take many forms, and I didn't realize how many Vermonters supported the Loyalist cause. We live in Thetford. There's a Stratford is right down the road. It's the next village over. And in Stratford, when Burgoyne came down in 1777 to try to take over Vermont, in the town next to me, 7 of its founding fathers' sons signed up to fight for Burgoyne. And they ended up fighting all the way into Saratoga because there was support for the Loyalist cause. And I deal with it in my book here when I talk about having looked at some of the accounts, and a boy at that point, 16-year-old boy named Ebenezer Fletcher, who ended up getting overrun in the Battle of Hubbardton and was a prisoner. And he escaped through terrible conditions, it's all in the book. And he found that that the people who were the nicest were actually a couple of young kids who were British redcoats who took care of him. And he was surprised when he escaped. He was running on the run with the loyalists. Look how many loyalists there were out to get him. And so this includes the book I'm talking about. But I'll explain it. The book follows 3 people who served in the American who were Green Mountain Boys. One was Ethan Allen, one was Seth Warner, and the third was Justice Sherwood. Does anybody know who Justice Sherwood is? Justice Sherwood was the town clerk of, he was a 3rd generation American, had come over here. But when it came time to break from Britain and sign the Patriot Oath, he refused to sign it. And he was taken out and beaten. His property was grabbed. He was treated very badly. And he ended up, as town clerk of this town, burying all the records of the town and disappearing. And he ended up fighting for the British. And he became their master spy on the northern front of the American Revolution, which is right up here. And he was running spy operations right down through here. And I find him kind of sympathetic. He was fighting for the wrong side, but he really believed in the cause. And so patriotism takes many forms. And Ethan Allen once quipped that hell had to exist because otherwise where would you put all the Tories? So bear with me. I want to talk about the sources I had for the book before we get into it. Why would a journalist write a book about this? I read all the earliest books I could find, and that includes the history of Vermont, which you're free to look at. You can look up when you finish it. Where was that? What did I say?
Sources. You read a whole
Oh,
lot
the
of
sources.
sources.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, yes, that's what I was thinking, two lines ahead of me. I read a lot of the books, and they had, in Dartmouth, this special collection, Archives, with 20 books dating back to the 19th century, beginning with Ethan Allen's autobiographical narrative, his experiences, which was a bestseller in 1780 something, or 1770. And so I got that material, and then I began just combing through other places to the Vermont State Archives had a lot of material. I found more stuff out in the Newberry Library in Chicago and the New York Historical Society, and then we made 2 trips to the British Library in London, where they had a lot of the documents that I've been working with. They had original copies, so you could see the hand. You have, they always say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you have, once you learn to read the F's as S's, you could get access to this material. And it was a terrific experience to do this. I also had looked at government sites like the U.S. Naval Observatory, which has kept track of the phases of the moon all the way back to 1777. So when I get an account of people escaping from Ticonderoga is getting overrun and sailing down under a full moon, and you go back and check, and there was no full moon. Then how did they get away? Then it goes to the next scene. They all got away under cover of dark until somebody was dumb enough to set fire to his quarters and illuminate it, and then they were all targets. So, but and then I also was able to solo hike the long trail. You all know the long trail. It's much harder than it looks. And so I had to do it in 3 trenches. And I learned what it was like to cover these distances. If you think about Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys or Seth Warner's Green Mountain Boys rushing to fight in the Battle of Bennington, they walked 20-some miles, but they did that right then. They walked, they stopped to have some watery rum, because obviously the thing was that you can't go and fight a war if you don't have liquor. And a war would never get fought if people didn't have their liquor. And scouts who wanted to go out, they were given a half of, kind of a small shot, the equivalent of a shotgun of a couple of things to throw down, because that made you a better scout. Now, I haven't worked this out. They didn't do this when I was in the army. But, so anyway, this is what I wanted to say. Oh, I want to make a couple of other things here. I didn't realize how stingy Congress was. We all knock Congress now. But if you think you knock it now, what they were saying about it in 1780, they never paid back. They got John Stark. Everybody know John Stark? John Stark saved Vermont, and he was a officer who fought in New Hampshire. He was one of their top generals, and he didn't get promoted to a general. The Congress wouldn't do it, so he said to hell with him, and he agreed to come over. So he agreed to pull together the army that would save Vermont from being overrun, and they were New Hampshire men. And in fact, even in the early days, and I'll get back to that point, even in the early days when Ethan Allen was organizing people to do what was essentially vigilante raids, they would go up and they'd beat up anybody who claimed allegiance to New York, and they turned a lot of opinions, by flogging and beating. These were not the nicest people in this stage. Where was the other is that anyway, let me get back to where I was. The other thing you don't John Stark came in and saved the American the Vermonters in the Battle of Bennington, because he said, wherever you hold the line, Vermont holds the line, that's where Vermont's borders will be, because they'd been pushed all the way back down there. And John Stark brought in these militia units who were really gung-ho, and they came in and gung-ho, that's not the word. But they were really ready to fight for Vermont. And they came in and they were sending them over across the mountains into Vermont as fast as they could arm them. And they didn't have weapons sometimes, and so they were the people who really saved Vermont, John Stark and the Green Mountain Boys. The other thing I looked at as I realized, the Congress never paid back John Stark and his New Hampshire militiamen for their service at Bennington, which is a big battle. And John Stark himself was angry because during the Battle of Bennington his horse got stolen. And he said it was awful to have to fight a battle, but then to have some scoundrel steal your horse while you're doing it. And it was a favorite horse he had. I found that going through this, how miserable life could be fighting to survive through a northern winter without warmth or heat or life. And you know what it's like, you people, Vermonters, we're a tough crowd. But it's cold. But for people to go out and fight in those climates was really miserable. I was also interested in the women folk who were really heroines. The women You don't hear much about the women. The women sent their husbands and sons off to fight without knowing when or whether they would be coming home. And they didn't know whether they'd see them again. But they had to hold the families together. And even they didn't know what was happening. Seth Warner, as you know, they've taken his Green Mountain Boys up to fight up in Canada in a very crude invasion, a clumsy invasion of Canada in 1775. And a lot of the army was just battered. And what was the big enemy there, do you know? Smallpox. They caught smallpox. The British didn't have, some of the British didn't have that because they were tough. These were people out of the slums of London. And they didn't need all these things. But the Vermonters and New Hampshire people fighting up here, they fell prey to smallpox immediately. And they had a terrible time. And in fact, George Washington put a message out to forbidding anybody from trying to inoculate themselves. And Seth Warner took his troops and the Green Mountain Boys, and he showed them where to cut in their leg and pack it with a pus from the corpses who died of smallpox. And in that way he was able to save a lot of the Green Mountain Boys and some of the people coming south. It was a court-martial offense if you did that, and Washington didn't want it. The other thing I found was interesting was the flashes of decency and good, and I need to get a card to remember the details on the flashes of decency that was shown by people, and I'm thinking specifically of slavery. You're familiar with the situation of slavery in Vermont. Vermont was the first state, or it wasn't a state then, to outlaw slavery for adults, people who were slaves who were, and they'd been brought up from Connecticut at the end of the war, at the beginning of the American Revolution in Connecticut, and a lot of the people who came up here were from Connecticut. 1 in 4 families still own slaves in Connecticut. So when it came to slavery, I'm jumping around a bit, but Ethan Allen's cousin Ebenezer, of whom I'm going to talk, Ebenezer Allen, who you could describe him as a stone killer. He was a killer. His raiders, he was when the British were beginning to pull back and go to the north, he would his raiders, who basically Green Mountain Boys and their friends, would hit the British trying to retreat back up north. And one group, they hit them right across the water in New York. They hit a British column retreating, and they captured a slave, Dynamatis, and her baby infant, Nancy. And the Ebenezer Allen took a vote among his troops, and these guys carried hatchets, tomahawks, and scalping knives, and used them. And he said, what did they feel? And he said, it's being unconscious. I'm contentious that it is not right in the sight of God to keep slaves. And his raiders, this company of Green Mountain Boys, signed on and said, yes, we agree. And so he sat and wrote, and it's in the Bennington Library, Bennington Museum. He wrote a Emancipation Proclamation, say, I hereby say, I allow them to, Dinah and her baby, to travel anywhere she was in North America, and knowing that she has the right to her freedom. And this was a gutsy thing in those days, especially there were not people down in the South at this point were not happy about it. And I have one, I'll try to give it a thought. I should say a bit more about Ebenezer Allen. I'm jumping around, but he is one of my favorite of the Allen boys, of the Allen family, and he was the third cousin somewhere. They were all related for reasons that we can figure out later. But he was a killer, and when there was a story they tell about Montreal. I don't know if you know about this, of Ebenezer Allen coming back, and he had taken his Green Mountain Boys up the face of one of the big promontories near Fort Ticonderoga, and they'd taken the hill at night, at dawn, and took the British side and captured them and took them down. Ethan, let's see where I leave with him. Ebenezer Allen, who became his neighbor, who lived up here, had the. Where am I? I'm jumping around a bit too much. He as a major in the Green Mountain Boys, was able to go up and use the mess, the British mess, during one of the troops, and he came in and Ebenezer came in, he sat there, and he was wearing his buckskins, which is what they wore, and he hadn't shaved, and coonskin hat or whatever. And one of the British officers took umbrage. He says, "I challenge you, sir, to a duel. Your presence offends me in this officer's mess, and I challenge you to a duel, and you choose the time and the place." And Ebenezer looked at him and says, "The time is now. I put my pistol," and he pulled out his cavalry pistol. "I put my pistol in your house, in your mouth. You put your pistol in my mouth. At the command to fire, we both pulled the trigger." And the duel never happened. Because he knew that Ebenezer, the guy must have realized, Ebenezer was nuts enough to do it. So, now I want to mention one other thing here as we get into it. That I wrote in this thing, in my book, that Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys had a disrespect of authority, which was a signature American trait that continues to manifest itself today. And I think that happens today. I think Americans have, by nature, always been suspicious of authority, perhaps with good reason, whether it's now or later or before. And I think this is important. So I want to say that I want to finish up right now by reading something that I found in this book. And I'll use a copy that I used in the book of The Turbulent Sons of Freedom, that I quote, if I can find it here. And this is what the author of this book, Samuel Williams, who was kind of a friend of Ira Allen, wrote in this history of Vermont at the end. And he says, "You people of the United States, behold here the precarious foundation upon which you hold your liberties. They rest not upon things written upon paper, nor upon the virtues, the devices, or the designs of other men, but they depend upon yourselves, maintaining your property, your knowledge, and your virtue. You are now in full possession of all your natural and civil rights, under no restraint in acquiring knowledge, property, or the highest honors of your country." And then he concludes, "But nothing is so established among men that it may change and vary. If you should lose that spirit of industry, of economy, of knowledge, and of virtue, which led you to independence and to empire. Then, but not until then, will you lose your freedom. Preserve your virtues, and your freedom will be perpetual. So I'll break right there. If you have some questions, we can get into more specific things. Any comments? Yeah.
So why did the citizens from New Hampshire come to fight Vermont? Because it was for patriotic reasons or economic reasons, or were they going to get rewarded with land, or what was their motivation?
They were neighbors. When communities moved up from Connecticut, and Ethan Allen was from Connecticut, when they moved up from Connecticut, they often moved up in hold of families and communities. You moved up because why would you want to move and they moved in the winter? Why would you move in the winter? The rivers are frozen, so they could come up and pull their sleds. Otherwise, so they would move everything in the winter and move up here. And so if you look at the whole situation along the Connecticut River where we are, people were related to each other back and forth. So this is why they all tended to, if not agree, they tended to understand the people on the other side. And this created problems later when Vermont decided to, try to become independent, and they began grabbing whole towns in New Hampshire, and then sort of basically annexed them because those are our cousins and this is theirs. So they went there. But that's I think the reason. Yeah.
Do we know much about the rank and file Green Mountain Boys?
The Green Mountain Boys were basically. They were basically militia raised by Ethan Allen to terrorize the New Yorkers, and they were sort of vigilantes, and their job was to go in and scare the hell out of anybody, and they did whippings and such.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as a descendant of quite a few of them, I want to disagree a little bit because
Please do.
because these people came first to Vermont or to the New Hampshire grants, thinking that they legally had the land, that Benny Wentworth had granted them the land.
Yeah.
These people came into the wilderness, cleared it, built a little home, trying to grow crops and whatever, and to have somebody coming over from New Hampshire New York saying, wait a minute, this isn't your land. I think it's fairly reasonable to think that people would fight back in that situation. Now, maybe they got a little carried away at certain points in time, but I think they had a valid point that they had settled the land. Why should somebody else come over and say, no, that's yours, and where would they go from there,
Yeah, and that is where Ethan Allen argued this, and he
Yes.
actually took it down. They had the hearing in Albany, wasn't it?
Yes.
And he
And
made the
Stephen
case,
Fay,
and the
Phase went, my great-grand,
who was the judge there ruled against him,
yeah.
and then helped himself to 20,000 acres of Vermont, and so yes, that's how it worked.
And so once the revolution came, they already were a militia, kind of.
Well, they've been
almost kind of a
vigilantes, and
thing,
they've been beating up
and,
people and hanging them on from
And
posts.
so they became part of the whole picture.
And then they, I think it was under Seth Warner that they pulled them out to become a coherent fighting force, and they brought those in. And what they did, that Ethan Allen had Seth Warner had a technique there when they were trying to get out of, they had this invasion of Canada, and it was a disaster, and they lost 5,000 people. And as they pulled, as they brought them south, let's see, he developed a technique of strategic withdrawal, where the British, or in this case the Braunschweigers, were coming. They'd shoot them, they'd force them to deploy and then pull back, and then they deploy, and meanwhile they retreat, and then they dig in again, and they force them to deploy, And this is a technique that is now used in the American Army for strategic withdrawals. When I was in Korea, I remember we practiced it over and over to try to stop the enemy, and it really saved the American Army from being wiped out on that retreat. Yeah.
Did any of the Green Mountain Boys ever fight with Rogers Rangers?
Yeah, there was. I don't think he was with there. There were some people from Rogers Rangers who were involved. It wasn't Ethan Allen. I'll have to think of it. But Rogers Rangers, you know, he was quite impressive. They had the Battle of the Snowshoes up at Ticonderoga, where they fought on snowshoes. Remember Baker, I think, was a ranger. He's the one who was a cousin of Ethan Allen, and he's the one who was doing all the spy work up on the British in the north until he got into a fight. The Iroquois came over, and they exchanged shots, and he was killed, and they took his head and cut it off, took it to the British to get a reward. And that galvanized everybody to fight the British on that one. So, anyway, now the question I've been beating around a bit, did I get it?
Yeah, I was just also curious to know that Rogers remained loyal to the crown, and
Yeah.
I was curious whether after the war, I know that he went back to England, and I was just curious whether there's any more contact between Allen and
No,
Rogers.
I don't think there was. It was they wouldn't have occasion to, because he was now a loyalist. He was fighting for the British, and he had a drinking problem at that point, and was not very effective. Yeah.
Where do you see parallels today with Ethan Allen's ideals and values then, and I think in particular of the Protestant Scots-Irish, who through our history have been fighters and fiercely independent, sticking to their values and willing to fight for them. So where do you see values today that Ethan Allen would approve of?
Well, I think he'd be very comfortable with them. The Scots-Irish who came over to this country, they all came over in mass. They did not go through. I'm not putting this very well, but when they came over from England and Ireland, or Scotland and Ireland, they came over as all together, and they did not amalgamate. And they did a lot of the heavy fighting for the American Revolution down in the South during the Southern campaign with Nathaniel Greene and such. But Ethan Allen looked for allies wherever he could find them. He wanted to make sure that he had, if they would work with him, he'd work with them, and he wanted to have an art. He'd never really fought in a battle. He had one battle up at St. John's, up the hills, where he took his Green Mountain Boys in, and they got knocked around by the British, because the British had brought in a cannon, and he wasn't quite used to this. But I think that there was a whole spirit in the American Revolution that also happened down south, and we were, as I said, we were talking about the book in Pennsylvania, I guess last week. Anyway, I'm beating around your point, but I think it's a fascinating thing to me that they never went through the whole formal immigration that other Americans went through, the Scots-Irish. They just came over and they were here. And the same thing with Ethan Allen. They came over. He was pushing up. He was going up to the north to get land. He grew up in a small town in Cornwall, now Cornwall, Vermont, and where they had so many rattlesnakes that they had to they paid you to take the rattlesnakes and get them out of there. So anyway, did I answer your question there more or less? Or?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about Moses Robinson.
Oh,
I
yes.
assume you kind of ran into him, but I want to say hello to anybody I gave a talk here about the Haldeman negotiations
Oh, yes.
a while ago. So,
Oh, good.
And also it was Benedict Arnold who led the soldiers from Boston to Quebec City and had that disastrous, and that's where Montgomery got killed.
Yeah, the battle of
Smallpox.
the battle of Quebec, and they went in and they were all on 90-day enlistments, I think, weren't they? And they had to, and they were gonna, and they had terrible fighting up there, and they were fighting in
They had to quit, and then that's when they got smallpox.
yeah.
And my question about Moses Robinson is, did you run into his story? Because, Judge Mello wrote this fantastic book called Moses Robinson and the Founding of Vermont, and he had a parallel story of the Green Mountain Boys.
Mhm.
Along, there was Ethan's story, and then there's sort of Moses Robinson's story.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you ran into Moses Robinson and what you thought.
I did in a sense, yes, and I know the book. It's a very good book, and I was on the board of a trustee for the Vermont Historical Society for a while, and that's where I knew about the book. And there are people who, like Moses Robinson, whose stories have been kind of eclipsed. I mean, Ethan Allen gets all the attention. There are other people who are, one could argue, is just as deserving. But Ethan Allen's strength that he was colorful. I'll just say a word about the invasion when he got captured. Sorry. He got captured when Ethan Allen got captured in trying to capture Montreal, and they did a hash of it, and got sent off to England to be hanged. Let's see now, what's the point of this? And when he was taken over to England to be, did I mention this? They developed a new gallows. It was a great hit in England and called the Tyburn. And Tyburn was where they set up an area where they would set up this gallows, three-sided, so you could hang three people at once. And this was a huge success because in England, this was entertainment. People would go out and see this, see who could hang three people. But Ethan, let's see, I beat around your question, didn't I?
Well, the question is, did you follow the Moses Robinson story through the Revolution and into his...
I didn't get into it. No, the book is very good, and he's one of these. There are several characters who they've said saved Vermont, and he's certainly a good candidate there. There's a lot of, I just couldn't cover all the people in the book. The editor just stopped it down. He said, "You spent too much time in the archives," and then just slashed and burned.
And you just reminded me about the hanging.
Yeah.
I called the Cornwall Historical Society.
Yeah.
And I called the castle, and I did all the research.
Over in England, yeah, in
They don't
Pendennis.
acknowledge, they don't know who Ethan Allen is, and they don't acknowledge that he was ever there, which corresponds today to renditions
Mm-hmm.
where, no, he wasn't here.
No.
They were never-
Yeah, I should say he was taken over on a ship with the people who'd been captured in Montreal, and it was kind of a cage, and they were kept in this wooden cage. I don't know if it was on deck or just below, in these terrible storms, and they were given a bit of liquor, but there was no toilet facilities in it, and they got off this ship, and he was just crusted with dirt and manure and such, and somebody came up and said that told him the odds were that in London that he would get hanged for treason. But the problem is that it was argued, well, he was an American. How can he be hanged for treason? That he was a Brit, and so the argument: did he serve? You couldn't hang him if he was a British. He was entitled to a separate trial. And meanwhile, people, the lords and ladies in their carriages, were going up to Pendennis and other places to meet Ethan Allen, and he really played on it. He was a good. He was good copy, as we say for journalists, and he'd talk about what he was going to do and what went wrong and everything. And he also was a very good writer. He wrote these accounts of what was happening, and so when they took him to England, there was a deal that was arranged in Britain where they had a meeting what to do with Ethan Allen on the day after Thanksgiving, 1775, on what to do with Ethan Allen, and George Washington said, well, if they hanged Ethan Allen, then of course the Americans had captured the General Prescott, who had the troops in Canada, and they'd hang him too. And so they decided not to do that. That what they would do instead is bribe him, because the King George, found that the most successful technique he had was to bribe his opponents. And you'd offer this and that. And so they tried to bribe Ethan Allen. But whatever Ethan Allen took, he did what he wanted to do anyway. So. Anything more here? Yeah. Right here and then right there. Okay.
What role did Anne Story play in your book?
Anne Story is a very colorful character. She was not in my book because I had to cut it back somewhere. She was the one who saved the people in her house, and they had women. They had women who fought. And if you look at the accounts of, other people fighting, you know, in the invasion of Quebec by the Americans, some of the women, when they went on Benedict Arnold's trip through Maine, that they had the wives there. But generally, the wives ended up holding the whole families together, holding the whole communities together, because there was nobody else to do it. And the women, they worked, they sacrificed as much as anybody, I think. And one of the things, going to my book, there are a couple of cases, particularly that the women do not get sufficient credit for this. And it'd be nice if somebody could write a whole history of this just from the women's perspective. And another question.
There are some writings that suggest that when Seth Warner, you'd mentioned about Seth Warner organizing a militia and so on.
Yeah.
Some writings said that the Green Mountain Boys, as the body, elected Seth Warner over Ethan Allen.
Yes.
And did you find any evidence of that, or what may have been some of the reasons other than his bombastic character or whatever?
Yes, what happened is that that when they elected, that the Congress gave money, allocated the money to go to take them into the war, the Green Mountain Boys into the war, but the British, let's see, where am I now?
Well, why did they choose Seth Warner over Ethan Allen?
Seth Warner was more reliable. Ethan Allen could be kind of a loose cannon, and they didn't want to have them. Seth Warner was solid. He was respected in the community. He was 6'4" at a time when the average heights of soldiers or men were 5'8", and he was very popular. And he had this gift of being calm and the old settlers who actually decided who was voted on liked him, and they did not trust Ethan Allen, because Ethan Allen, when he captured Fort Ticonderoga, the first thing he did was bring his boys in, and they found the liquor supply, and they drank dry 90 gallons of hard liquor, and then they partied. And Ethan and Benedict Arnold said, "This is disgraceful," and he insisted on counting the weapons, doing all the work. But Ethan Allen was what he was. There's a great account in the stories by one, and I'll think of this moment, in the Pennsylvania troops, when he was on parole in New York, and one of Alexander Graydon, who was a Pennsylvania colonel who lived with and parole with him, and talked about what a colorful person he was, and the language he used, and how interesting he was. It didn't mean that he was a great commander, but he wore down his enemies, and he was very good in what he wanted to do and get it done. and it was about to keep the land, preserve the land, and not let anybody have what they don't do. And he hated New Yorkers. So,
I
Yeah,
brought
here.
this up earlier, but I just wanted to, I found the record about
Yeah.
the letter that Jonas Fay
oh yes,
wrote, and the image is here, and this is the description. It's kept at the Bennington Museum, and the description says, this letter from Jonas Fay to Orsamus C. Merrill, who was a congressman at that point in time in Washington from Vermont. This was dated in 1806. He's discussing the Haldimand negotiations between the British and Vermont, evidence that may exist, and reinforces the accuracy of Samuel Williams' description of events in Volume 2 of Natural and Civil History of Vermont, which I thought was wonderful.
Yeah.
You actually have a copy of it here. Jonas Fay states that Washington was fully aware of the subterfuge against the British and the negotiations with General Haldimand, and the purpose was to secure a northern frontier that kept British troops in Quebec during the Revolutionary War. So that's just another slant on.
The Haldeman negotiations I didn't get into. Good part of the book is devoted to that, and in fact, all my sources on that were original documents that I found in the British Library. But it was a
So that was the British version.
what's that?
That's from the British version of it. is
They
that-
were the American, well, but all they ended up being taken from here over to England,
Okay.
and they were the original copies. And I always try to go for original copies when I can.
Okay.
But it's interesting.
His letter that I was able to read a little bit online said that they had not left anything in their writing or whatever, any evidence.
Well, Justice Sherwood was a great, beautiful, but I don't know that Ethan Allen left anything. Well, he wrote the book on his early history.
He was talking about himself too,
Yeah.
because there was a group of them that were involved.
Well, he never tired about talking about himself. No problem. That's good. But the Haldeman thing is a whole, and somebody else mentioned that, it's a whole new story about how these secret negotiations were started, going through Justice Sherwood, who was a spy master up here, working to try to take Vermont into Canada as an autonomous province.
Right.
And
his
I
point
always
was
says,
that they
what's
weren't-
that?
That was not the purpose, but.
Well, what would it look like? It would look like it looks like Ontario. It's amazing when you think about the plans they had. It would be like Ontario instead of northern Vermont, and not that all that much. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment. I did some research on Mallett's Bay and Colchester.
Oh, yes.
I just want to comment that Ira Allen really was a land grabber, and they have some of his original documents where he's grabbing the land. But he also died he's buried in a pauper's grave in Pennsylvania because the town of Colchester, which was Zanussi then, he didn't pay his taxes. So we all have to get this straight about the Allen boys, that they really were taking a lot of land. And that Ethan Allen, they say that he's supposed to be buried at Greenmount Cemetery on Colchester Avenue, but they were afraid to bury him there for fear of the people robbing his grave. And being a loyalist to the crown wasn't unusual during the American Revolution. So my ancestors from Nantucket, they all moved to Dunkirk and France. So it's very common. It was all economically driven. But Ira Allen, it was really something else.
But I thought there was another issue too. Didn't he buy some guns over?
Oh, that's
over
yeah.
there?
That's a
And
different.
He expected to get payment, and then that didn't happen. So that
He
was one of his.
that was the 20,000 muskets.
Yeah.
He bought the.
That
he
was
was.
one of the reasons he was destitute.
He arranged to buy 20,000 muskets to take back to outfit the militias here, and the ship that was sailing out of Austin got grabbed by the British, which saw it coming along, and they grabbed it because they thought the guns were going to the Irish rebels, so they held it. And Ethan Allen had to. Ira had to go and prove that they were going to America. And he tried to, and he spent a lot of money, and he ended up being broken.
Yeah.
And he died in Philadelphia
Yeah.
because he was wanted up here for on bankruptcy charges that he owed, you know. And so he couldn't go back here. He would have been thrown into debtor's prison. And so
But some
he went
people
down.
backed out on the deal, and the way I understand it, I mean, he was kind of stiffed by some people who were supposed to be paying for those.
Well, they
those
were.
guns.
I mean,
it wasn't just property taxes. I mean, there were other
everybody,
issues too.
everybody had jerked around on this one, yes. But it's a fascinating story. I end with a book on that.
I think we can agree that there are several different issues here, and we do want to thank you. And maybe if we just have a couple more questions, and then we'll end up, and we'll let Christopher go out. There are some books of his out there for sale, and I'm sure he'll be glad to sign them for you and answer any continuing questions that we might have. And in the meantime, if you give us your attention, we'll just do a couple of things. So are there a couple more questions here, quickly?
Oh, yes.
I think you mentioned that Ethan Allen's only battle was Montreal, and I was wondering what, if any, role he played in the Battle of Hubbardton.
He was not involved with the Battle of Hubbardton. That was Seth Warner.
Yeah.
And Seth Warner is the one who gathered all the troops there and stopped the British cold. And there's a British historian, Turbulent, who said that the intensity of the battle for Hubbardton against the Green Mountain Boys and their allies from Massachusetts was the same as the hotspot of the key battle of Waterloo in Canada. Because the British said, well, it was this hard because it was hand-to-hand fighting, and the Green Mountain Boys would fight, pull back, fight, pull back, fight, and they took out 21, I think. The first lead platoon coming over the thing, they dropped 21 of them in the first volley. So these people were good shots. Okay.
All right. On behalf of the Ethan Allen Homestead
I'm
Museum,
thrilled.
we have a cup for you, and we know that you brought your wife with you, so we have one of Ethan, one of Ira, and I know Ira's not,
These are terrific.
but
And anything I
just as a
said,
token of what we have here.
anybody just read the mug, because the truth is really here. And what I said, don't believe what I said. It's all in the mug. Thank you very much.
All right.
So we'll just listen to a couple of announcements that John has for us, and maybe Christopher would like to make his way out to the table
Okay.
before he
If
gets
you
some.
would like to, if you want to
Swamp
head out
with
that
Yeah,
way,
sure,
the
yeah.
book signing will be on the table out
Okay.
there. And if we don't, if we sell out the books, I think we have about a dozen left because we already sold a few. We could order some others and get them to you if you would like to make those arrangements afterwards. We could do that.
I'll take this.
A set of sunglasses were found in the parking lot. Is there anybody here who may have lost some sunglasses today? Maybe they've been out there for a while because there are people on the trails, but, okay, that's the first item.
I think Christopher had something to say.
I'll just take this out when you want to look at it out there. It's
That's
quite
the Samuel
interesting.
Williams,
Yeah, Samuel Williams thing, and it's all. I marked a lot of pages when I was doing my research, and I decided to leave the tags in there.
Okay,
Thank
a
you.
couple of quick commercials here, and then we'll let you be on your way. Whatever your views are on Ethan Allen, I think he was a fantastic writer. And if you've never read the narrative, you should probably buy yourself a Christmas present.
That is a great.
This is a great read, and if you don't like to read, we also have the CD, which Jim Hogue, where's Jim? He's sitting right here. Jim has put this together. It's a two-volume, two disc, complete narrative of Ethan Allen's captivity book on his captivity.
That's great.
This is a hard read. This is The Reason, the Only Oracles of Man, the book that Ethan wrote about his philosophy. It took me 2 tries to make it through this. This is not easy reading. But we have something that you won't find on Amazon. We have a little booklet that we just had reprinted here about a month ago. And it was written by J. Michael McBride, who some of you may know taught at Champlain College. And he gave a talk here on the reason the only oracles of man in 2001. And he actually, there is a summary of his talk that he gave here at that time. And his widows allowed us to have these reprinted. So they're $5. What it is, I know none of you in here know what crib notes are, but some of your children would know what they are. He has like 1 page for every chapter of the book explaining how this goes. So if you wanted to read this book, having this with it could make it very understandable and enjoyable. So, Christmas is coming. What we do in our family, we ask our friends and relatives not to give us gifts, to make donations to our favorite charities, and mine is this one. My wife is the Food Shelf, and so maybe some of you might consider trying to do that in your own families. Finally, our next, we don't do a talk in December because of the holidays. Our next talk is going to be January 28th. Mike Ather, who spoke here maybe about 5 years ago, I'm not sure what his title is, but I think he's sort of a naturalist. He gave a talk here on the foliage and the plants in the intervale and what is edible and so forth. Very, very fantastic talk. We haven't yet finalized what he's going to talk about this time, but if you've never heard Michael, I think you would enjoy that. And if you're on our email list, we will get a notice about that, January 28th. And again, Christopher, thank you for coming all the way across the state.
It's been a great audience.
You know as much as
All right,
I do.
folks, so head out there, refreshment. Yeah, one last question over here.
When is this presentation going to be on television?
Okay, what's going to happen in terms of the television? We have Jim back here, who is recording the program. Channel 17 will send me a notice of when it's going to be shown on Channel 17, and also a link that you can watch it on your computer at your own convenience. And as soon as I get that information, usually sometimes next week, I will send it to everybody on the list, so you'll have that. Okay? All right, thank you all for coming.